Hello everybody, welcome back to the Intercooler podcast with me, Dan Prosser, and Andrew Frankel in the chair opposite me in our studio. And this week, Andrew, this is sort of heartland stuff for you, isn't it?
Well, I hope so.
This is a topic right up your street.
I hope it's interesting.
This is the point I was going to make. This is a topic right up your street. We're talking about 1950s, 60s, and 70s British F1 drivers who looked like they might have quite special careers in many cases.
Yeah.
But in every single instance, their career was cut short by being killed in a race or injured to such an extent that they couldn't race again.
Yeah, and I guess the reason I wanted it, I'm always a bit sort of nervous when we sort of, when it appears to be, the reason for doing a podcast is because we can talk about a lot of people who had horrible deaths. It's not really the reason for it. The reason is that whenever one of these events happen, what tends to happen, or when these lives are reflected upon, someone always pops up and where it goes, sort of future world champion. And I guess that's completely understandable, but obviously we will never know. But one of the sadnesses as somebody who's very interested in the sport and all eras of the sport is so many of these people never got the credit for it. I mean, one example is, which literally just occurred to me as I'm sitting here because it's not Formula One, is Ken Miles. The star of the Le Mans 66 or Ford versus Ferrari film, depending on which country you saw it in. Ken Miles had always been a bit of a hero of mine. And until that film came out, nobody knew who he was.
I didn't know.
No, nobody did. Because very sadly, he died before he managed to do a lot of the things that, he was almost certainly capable of doing. So really, I just wanted to sort of look back, pay tribute to all these brave British drivers. And we kind of had to restrict it just because the awful thing is there are so many.
Yeah.
It is unimaginable. But, in the 50s and particularly in the 60s and the 70s, so many young men lost their lives or had career-ending accidents in these cars when they were, in some cases they were 22 years old. And, just sort of so, just a bit of a reflection, a look back at their lives, wondering in a few cases, what might have been, and really just mentioning their names, getting their names out there to a bunch of people who, there will be names on this list that almost everybody, even the very, very well-informed enthusiasts who listen to this podcast, may never have heard of.
And actually, they're human stories in every case, aren't they? And in some instances, the stories that we're about to tell are extraordinary. So, I don't know, 50s, 60s, 70s racing, motorsport might not be your thing, but honestly, these human stories are going to be interesting to you, I am sure. So should we kick off then? Where are you starting?
Well, okay, let's start. Let's start with somebody who I don't think ever was going to make it. But there's a particular fact about his career which does make him extraordinary. It's a chap called Alan Stacy.
No idea.
No.
Literally no idea.
Okay. So Alan Stacy was one of two British drivers who got killed in the same race in the Belgian Grand Prix in 1960. Alan Stacy, he'd been quite a successful racer.
Is this Spa?
It is Spa.
Yeah.
He'd been quite a successful racer of sports cars. He'd done quite a lot of development work on Lotus's first mid-engine Formula One car, the Lotus 18. And he was driving one of these things at Spa. And nobody really knows what happens. The consensus seems to be, and his great friend Innes Ireland stated it as fact that what caused his death was literally he just got hit in the face by a bird, and the car went out of control at the terrible speeds that that those flimsy old racing cars used to get to going around the old Spa, and that was that. The reason for mentioning him at all was he was an amputee.
Oh, blimey.
He lost quite a lot of his right leg in a motorcycle accident, I think when he was 17 years old. And he could only race in Formula One with a hand throttle, which was part of the gear lever. So he was already massively disadvantaged there. You can imagine just how, particularly with those sorts of cars, with those very, very high revving sensitive, just how sensitive you have to be on the throttle. and not to be able to have, the use of a limb that's designed to do that. So I always thought that, when we think of drivers with a disability, people think of, understandably, of Archie Scott Brown and all that he achieved. But nobody's ever heard of Alan Stacy.
No.
And in some races, the only way... there was one... There was a race in France he was going to do. And he had to have a medical. And he wasn't, and somebody within his condition would not have been allowed to do the race. And so the story goes, they did a sort of knee reflex test. And so they tested the good knee. And then a French journalist called Jabby Cronbach distracted the doctor, at which stage Stacy crossed his legs and managed to persuade him to retest the good knee all over again. And that's the only reason he got in the race. So yeah, I just wanted to shout out because he's the only other driver I know who raced with a disability of that kind. And that race, Spa 1960. In fact, so Sterling Moss had a terrible accident in that race. He broke his back and his nose and his legs, and and we're not going to dwell on people like Sterling and people like Jim Clark, who everybody knows had either died or had their careers ended, because this is really trying to focus on the lesser known characters. But yeah, so there were three drivers apart from Sterling who had two fatal and one career-ending accident in the same race.
That's unbelievable.
It is.
Do we need to mention? We'll talk about Archie Scott Brown in a bit more detail, because he is a fascinating story. His is a fascinating story. People will probably know the name, but they might not know the full extent of the disadvantages he was born with.
Well, I mean, he was born with only... I mean, you read a story about him, didn't you? So, you're probably better placed to tell me than that. But he had very short legs, didn't he? And I think he only had one properly functioning arm.
He was born with his feet on backwards.
Yeah.
And, the doctors had to break them time and time again when he was young and put them in... they're not casts really, but some kind of structure to fix them in place to bring his feet back round to where they should be.
Yeah.
He was, I can't remember which side it was, but I think he was born left-handed, except that he didn't have one, so he had to learn to make his right hand his dominant hand. And he was tiny in stature.
Yeah.
But by the sounds of it, enormous in spirit and character.
Yeah, and one of the biggest hurdles he faced. And talk about adding insult to very considerable injury, was literally just persuading the authorities to let him drive cars.
Yeah.
And he would have unquestionably had a proper Formula One career if they'd let him race in it. I mean, he did some non-championship Formula One events. He became best known for racing Listers, because Brian Lister basically designed, the famous knobbly Lister. The prototype of that car was basically designed for Archie. Sadly, it doesn't exist anymore. Although I think Lister Engineering today are thinking hard about creating another one. And in Listers, I mean, he was as quick as any of them. I mean, he beat Sterling Moss in straight fights.
Yeah, unbelievable.
Yeah. So yeah.
But he had an accident at Spa as well, didn't he? Did it kill him that day, or was it later on?
I think he lasted a few hours. It was basically, he had the same accident that Dick Seaman had at the same corner at the same track 20 years earlier. He was leading the race. He was in a dice with another driver called Maston Gregory, another very successful, famous Formula One sports car racer. And it was raining, and he just went off. After the accident, and he was conscious. He just said he was going too fast. And very sadly, he crashed, couldn't get out of the car caught fire.
Yeah.
Magnesium is probably going to figure again during the course of this podcast. That very lightweight metal, but when it goes up, you can't put it out.
No,
certainly not with what your average Marshall might have had trackside at Spa in 1958.
We all remember being at school with a Bunsen burner and a little strip of magnesium.
Exactly.
And the way it lights up.
Just white hot.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, unimaginable temperatures. That was the end of poor old Archie Scott Brown. Yeah.
Crikey. Yeah, I mean, this episode's going to be full of tales like that. Extraordinary people. Just... Let's keep rattling through it, because there are some amazing tales.
Seeing as we're at Spa in 1960 with Alan Stacy, let's also deal with Chris Bristow. Probably another name most people haven't heard of.
I haven't heard of it.
Chris Bristow was really interesting. I mean, he was terribly young. So I've got to look at my notes here. But yeah, he was one of the 22-year-olds. And he was a tearaway. Some people predicted that what would happen to him because even Sterling would say you had to drive in a certain way. And although he very rarely left anything, on the plate in terms of safety margins, he was so good. He always knew what he was doing, and he always knew what he would do if something untoward happened. Whereas I think Chris Bristow just drove as fast as he possibly could.
Yeah, and there's a difference there, isn't there? There is a key difference. Driving as fast as you can while still somehow having something in reserve.
Yeah.
And driving as fast as you can,
yeah.
And there's nothing left.
Exactly.
There's a difference.
But, I mean, how quick was he? Well, in his first ever Grand Prix, which was Monaco, qualified third. Yeah?
Quick, then.
Quick. Monaco, third. He came seventh. But the terrible sadness is, I think he did like sort of 2 or 3 races. As soon as he got to Formula One, he then went and had this. He was dicing with a bloke called Willie Morose, who was known for very good reasons as Wild Willie. And so the two of them were just going faster and faster and faster until one of them fell off. And he had this appalling accident, which I won't go into. But Jim Clark was kind of like next on the scene. And after what he saw there, Jim Clark always hated racing at Spa.
Really?
Yeah, it was just terrible. Utterly traumatic.
Actually, motorsport 50, 60, 70 years ago was really quite unpleasant, wasn't it? It could be. It was not very nice at all.
Well, I mean, if you think about the cars, so, a lot of these accidents, so even the monocoque, which did a lot to help people, not enough, but at least you were in a proper structure. Before that, they had these spindly little space frame chassis. And basically, they just put petrol wherever they could fit it. So you basically, you'd be in a bath of petrol. You'd have tanks either side of you, quite often a tank slung above your knees, and really no attempt to, at any kind of fire protection. And that's why a lot of the drivers were very against the use of seatbelts because they fancied their chances out of the car rather than in it.
And you can understand if you've been knocked out but you're strapped into this thing and it's burning.
Just don't.
Well, also the circuits were no good either, were they? The old Spa, the old Nürburgring.
I mean, utterly terrifying. You were fine while you were on the circuit, and if you were off the circuit, you might be fine or you might be dead. But the dividing line between the two was just astonishingly small, and it could be just the position of where someone decided to plant a tree, or where there might be a sort of a big gully or a runoff or something which might get your car rolling over and over, whatever. It is, well, you've only got to go and look at that great old John Frankenheimer movie Grand Prix, where there's a lot of real race footage and a lot of simulated race footage, but you get to see the circuits and the standards of safety they had at the time, and you just look at it and you just think, well, why did any of them ever get in the car? And the answer to that is they wanted to, and they didn't know any better.
Didn't know any better, yeah.
Yeah. So,
God, it makes you pause for thought, doesn't it? It's unbelievable. Let's keep going.
Okay. Well, just because he's next to mine, there's Peter Arundel. Heard of him?
No.
No? Okay, so he was the British Formula Junior champion in 1962 and 1963. Great prospect. What did he do? So, in his first F1 race, third at Monaco.
Yeah, blimey.
Then also third at Zandvoort the following year. But that year he was racing at Reims, spun the car, hit another car, came out of the car, lived, but was never the same again. He did come back briefly and did some. I mean, the accident was in '64. He didn't race again until '66. But he did one season, didn't really do much with it, and that was it. That was the end of his career. And I think he lived until about 15 years ago. And he used to turn up to Goodwoods and that sort of thing, but no, again, just a terrible career-ending accident at one of the fastest circuits you could possibly imagine.
This is off topic actually because it's a totally different era, and I'm only mentioning it because I listened to a podcast, F1 Beyond the Grid, with Martin Brundle last week, and he was talking about his accident that he had, I think 9 Grand Prix into his career, something like that. I can't remember where he was. You might remember.
Was it somewhere like? Sorry if you're listening to this, Martin. Was it Detroit, somewhere like that?
Oh, I think it was.
Yeah,
maybe it was. And he just shattered both feet.
Yeah.
And the sort of long-term consequence was that he couldn't left foot brake, which put him at a huge disadvantage for the whole of his Formula One career.
Yeah.
So and given that he was the bloke who stuck one up Senna in F3 for a year,
yes,
and Senna went on to become one of the greatest of all time, Martin probably would have achieved much more than he did without
that accident,
without that impediment.
I don't think there's any question, because the dividing line, it's just something like that, is enough to, because it's so fine, the margins are so tiny that any kind of impediment, let alone something as fundamental as that, is always going to, have a fundamental effect.
And he told the story of being in the hospital, I guess, in Detroit, and a nurse would keep coming around with a pin or something, and to his most badly damaged foot would, scratch it or tap it and say, "Can you feel that? Can you feel that?" And he couldn't, but he knew what was going on. And so he just said, "Yes, I can. Yes, I can," because otherwise they would have chopped it off.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And that's not even that long ago.
No. And don't forget, you had Johnny Herbert. The accident he had at Brands Hatch in Formula 3000. I mean, that was an enormous accident, from which he suffers to this day. Martin Donnelly, another one. Yeah, it wasn't. So this is 50s, 60s, and 70s, but it's not like it just stopped happening then.
No, not at
but
all.
Mercifully, it stopped happening with quite such terrible frequency. And a lot of the work that people, like, not just Jackie Stewart, who's the one that people always refer to, but also Graham Hill did a lot of work to improve circuit safety and the safety of the clothes that they were wearing. I can't remember when fire retardant overalls became mandated, but it would have been in the 1960s. So things got a lot better, but it wasn't really. I think it was only really when carbon fibre came along. I think that's probably the single greatest innovation in terms of saving drivers' lives, because carbon fibre came in the mid-1980s, and obviously some people did die in carbon cars, Roland Ratzenberger, Ayrton Senna, but really remarkably few. And obviously you can't just look at that, because also the circuits were evolving and everything else was evolving at the same time. But while you were still sitting in a bit of folded metal, in a bit of folded aluminium, if you hit something hard enough, bad things were likely to happen.
And with a jockey's helmet on your head as well.
Yeah, well, indeed, back then. But I mean, I can remember John Watson.
Yeah.
In the first carbon McLaren, having the most enormous accident at Brands Hatch. No, I think it was at Brands.
Was it?
I think it was out. I might be wrong. It might have been Monza, but I think it was it coming out of Hall? I don't know, wherever. But he had that accident, and you look at it and you're thinking that. I think the car separated and went in two different directions, and you're just looking at it, I think that really, he just hopped out of the thing.
Yeah. Maybe the first person to have his life saved by a carbon construction car.
Yeah.
All right. Let's get back to the sort of 50s, 60s, 70s then.
Okay. Where do you want to go next? Okay, so let's go to Tony Brise.
Yeah.
Have you got him?
He is on my list, yeah.
Okay. Would you want to do Tony Brise?
No, you do it and I'll chip in if I have something interesting to add.
Okay. He won... I think at the time there were lots of sort of F3 championships knocking about. And in 1 year he managed to win 2 of them. Would you imagine you're racing in 2 championships? I think that's quite impressive. He was massively quick in Formula Atlantic. And really his story, I mean, I maybe not of all of them, but I think he is one of the ones, because again, he was 23 when he died. So really, really on the uphill curve of his career. And he was noticed by Graham Hill. And when Graham Hill had started his own team and had realised, finally, sadly, maybe a bit too late, that his driving days at the top level were over, he was replaced by Tony Brise. And he did do in this thing called the GH1, which was the first hill Formula One car, which wasn't really a hill Formula One car. It was just a sort of modified old Lola chassis. He showed great promise. His teammate was Alan Jones, future world champion Alan Jones. And he often out-qualified him and outperformed him in this car. And then this other car for the 76 season, the GH2 came along. And it was a bespoke car. It was smaller. It was more streamlined. It was more efficient. It was very responsive to setup changes. It was looking really, really good. And that was the car they were testing at Paul Ricard in the south of France. It was all looking very encouraging for the 76 season. And they flew back to England in Graham Hill's aircraft. And on Archie Golf Course, just short of Elstree Airfield, it came down in fog, killing Hill, killing Brise, killing, I think, a couple of mechanics. And another terrible sort of what-if story came to its end.
Yeah. Gosh. So, who knows what Tony Brise would have achieved, but certainly more than 10 GPs and 1 points finish.
Absolutely. Piers Courage.
Has there ever been a finer name for a British racing driver?
Piers Courage. I mean, gosh, and he had it, didn't he? But he actually got it because he was the heir of a brewing empire.
Right.
You're probably too old to have drunk pints of directors, aren't you?
Too old?
Yeah. Too young. You don't see directors ale around anymore.
I'm not sure I've heard of directors, no.
Really?
Yeah.
It was quite a strong real ale made by, funnily enough, Courage.
Courage, yes.
And actually not because of Piers Courage, because I don't think I'd even heard of him at the time. But I was quite fond of that in my younger years. In fact, I'm sure if I found a pint of it somewhere else, I'd be quite fond of it now. But so he was a very well-resourced young man, Eton educated. And I think because of that, there is perhaps a temptation to sort of dismiss him in a sort of Peter Revson type way, who was the heir of the Revlon Empire, or at least related to it, as someone who only ever got where he got because he could buy the best drives and everything else. It's absolutely not the case with Piers Courage. He was really talented. And he trailed his own Formula cars around Europe behind a van. He wasn't he didn't behave like that. He got where he got on merit, and he was he won plenty of times in Formula 3 outright. Second at Monaco in '69, and at Watkins Glen, not an easy circuit in the US Grand Prix, and he was always doing it in second string cars. Private Brabhams. He was racing with Frank Williams when Frank, before he became a constructor, he had a race team, and he employed Piers Courage, and he was amazing. The race they talk about is Monza in '69, where in this this old underpowered Brabham, what was a BT26, I think, on this pure power circuit, where slipstreaming is the key, he somehow managed to keep up with all the really quick guys in his case. Eventually, I think he came fifth because something happened to the car. I think it was fuel starvation or something. But I think that's when people suddenly realised that he really was quite something. And then in 1970, they got rid of the Brabham and did a deal. Frank Williams did a deal with De Tomaso. And it didn't work out. The De Tomaso chassis was heavy. The car was unreliable. To make the chassis lighter, and you're going to know where I'm going with this, they made lots of it out of magnesium. And at the Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort, if you see people racing at Zandvoort these days, which is a beautiful, beautiful circuit, and you see them going out and you see all the sand dunes. Well, the original Zandvoort was that in spades. You have footage of it. It's absolutely one of the most beautiful circuits. The circuit was, apart from the main straight, it basically never, it just undulated through these curving swoops through these sand dunes. But it did mean that if something happened, you just didn't have anywhere to go. And something happened with Piers. There was something failed on the car. I can't remember what it was. And he had this enormous accident. I think people think that a wheel came off and hit him on the head, and so he was either certainly unconscious or already dead before the car caught fire. And you kind of have to hope that is the case, because once it went out, there was no putting it out.
I think Piers Courage was one of those drivers who would have achieved much more. So he started 29 Grand Prix, and because this was the era where reliability was often pretty shocking, he retired 18 times.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if he'd lasted long enough to race for a few years, the guy could probably have won Grand Prix, many more podiums. I mean, if you're coming second at Watkins Glen and second at Monaco, you're a heck of a driver.
You're a heck of a driver. Yeah. I mean, real driver circuits are actually quite different in their characters, but, you know, they're not like, well, I mean, to be honest, they're not like Monza, I guess, which is, I mean, Monza, you know, the Monza that they had then, which didn't have all the chicanes, it was a technical circuit, but it showed that you had to really be able to understand slipstreaming and how to do that. And he was obviously very good at that too. So I think he would have been fantastic. But, you know, he was, again, 26, 27 when he died? Still on the way up.
Since we're at Zandvoort.
Roger Williamson?
Yeah. So I think it was the same part of the track.
Yeah, it was.
Bloody hell. So let me jump in then. So this is Roger Williamson. So before he made his F1 debut, he won consecutive British F3 titles.
Yeah.
That makes you, certainly in that era, a damn good driver when British F3 was really something. It was actually essentially a feeder series to F1 for a lot of guys. Actually.
Completely. Absolutely it was, yeah.
So in 1973, Roger Williamson had a horrible fiery crash there. And this is the one where there is footage out there, and it's very, very easy to find, but you need to think long and hard
before you
go and watch it.
Yeah.
Was it used in a film, though? Was it used in the Senna film or something? It was made very prominent by a film or a show, a TV show at some point. I can't remember what it was. But you see, I think his car hits the barriers, flips over, catches fire.
Yeah.
And you see a driver, who we will come to in a moment.
Yeah. Because he's also part of this story too.
He is, sadly.
In his own right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he runs over,
yeah.
Tries to this burning car, tries to get his friend out of it. The marshals are standing by doing nothing.
The marshals they can't do anything.
They
haven't got anything. They're not wearing anything that's fireproof.
Yeah, so the driver's the only one there.
It is the only person who can even think about walking into the flames was, this other driver. They weren't actually. The friend bit is, I think, a bit of a myth.
Is it?
I don't think they knew each other that well.
Okay.
Which in many ways is...
it's all the more amazing.
It's all the more remarkable. For what he did.
So this other driver is running across the track to a marshal's point to it's still a live track to grab a fire extinguisher, back across the track to the car, emptying this thing into the car, but it's futile.
It's very early on in the race. The car's full of fuel.
Yeah, and you just see him. It's harrowing to watch, actually, and you see this guy flinging his arms around, trying to get someone to help him. He's running back and forth, just desperate, and no one is doing anything. No one is able to do anything. All the while, Roger Williamson is dying in this car. Yeah,
and I don't really want to dwell too much on it because if you you don't want to, but I think the absolutely appalling tragedy of Roger Williamson's death, as opposed to Piers Courage's, if you can possibly draw any distinction between them, is I think almost certainly Piers Courage was dead before the car went up, whereas we know Roger Williamson we don't think he was even injured. So anyway, I think but seeing as, we're on that subject, a word or two about his...
the other driver.
The other driver who tried to save him.
David Purley. Yeah.
So David Purley, ex-army man, was he a Marine? Was he SAS?
Don't know.
Brave as they can. Brave as they can. So his intervention in the Roger Williamson accident earned him the George Medal.
Yeah.
And they don't just give those away. And he was incredibly brave. Very, very good in Formula 2. He used to say that the old Rouen circuit, which there are bits of the Rouen circuit, the bit of Rouen after the pits where you go down the hill, there's nothing at the Nürburgring that's half as frightening as that. It's the most frightening section of any track I've ever been to. And Purley used to say in his F2 car, the only way he could get down the hill flat without lifting his foot was literally just to scream into his helmet the entire way down the hill. And then he could do it. And then I think David Purley probably is a name that quite a few people listening to this will know. And they'll know his name for one reason only, which is that he survived what was up until that time the biggest crash in a Formula One car that there'd been.
So this is 1977 British Grand Prix, Silverstone. Throttle stuck open
on his leg.
There you go. And he, at 108 miles an hour, he hit the was it a tyre barrier?
I think it was a tyre barrier, but there were some railway sleepers involved, and basically he just essentially stopped.
108 miles an hour to nothing in 26 inches. It's a 180G impact. I did the maths actually. For a split second, he weighed 13 tons. Just him. It's one of the biggest F1 crashes ever when the driver survived.
Yeah.
It's just extraordinary that he survived that. Multiple broken bones. And it...
Oh, yeah, and I think he was... he went into sort of cardiac arrest in the ambulance and, yeah...
So it ended his top-line career, although he did come back and race again, not at that level.
Yeah.
But clearly he realised that he wasn't going to race cars again to the standard he used to race them. And so he took up another discipline.
Yes. He flew.
He flew aerobatic planes.
Yeah.
And he was killed when his plane crashed into the English Channel.
Yeah.
When he was aged 40. But of course he is best remembered forever for his heroics at Zandvoort, trying to save Roger Williamson.
I mean, I think David Purley was a genuine daredevil. I think that he
sounds it, doesn't he?
I think he always had to live life on the edge, and I think that he probably understood the sort of the Faustian nature of the contract that he was making, and that it may well not end up that brilliantly, but that was, I suspect, to him, more than a risk worth taking, a price worth paying, if he could, do what he wanted to do, which is, go and fight the bad guys in the army, race Formula One cars, or fly stunt planes.
Bloody hell.
Yeah. How much time do we have left? Because there are a couple I do want to get onto, because I think these are the guys from very different eras who I think really could have become something.
We've got plenty of time. Is one of them Tom Pryce?
Yeah.
So is he the one who really was tipped for big things?
I think he was, and I think his record shows it. He's also the only Welshman ever to have raced in Formula One.
Is that true? I did, because I thought it might be the case.
I think it's true. Maybe someone listening to this who is Welsh or knows a Welsh Formula One driver is utterly outraged and is shouting at their whatever they're listening to this on and saying, "No, you've forgotten Fred." Or Gareth.
But certainly he was the sort of most successful Welsh racing driver.
Yeah.
There's no question about that.
Yeah. He is certainly the only Welsh racing driver to have won a Formula One race.
Yeah, just not a championship one.
No. But the Race of Champions, I went to a Race of Champions at Brands in the 1970s.
And this is before it was in a stadium with lots of different cars, lots of different disciplines.
It's
this
Formula
is
One
proper.
race. The only difference between it and a World Championship Formula One race is you didn't get points at the end of it.
Yeah.
It was a Formula One race, and usually all the big teams. I mean, the Race of Champions I saw was won by Gilles Villeneuve in a works Ferrari.
Yeah, it sounds like a World Championship F1 race.
It sounds like a World Championship F1 race, yeah, and with good reason. And he won that.
He won the Race of Championship
75,
Brands Hatch 75.
Yeah,
and I looked back through the list of his competitors actually, and I counted John Watson, multiple Grand Prix winner, Ronnie Peterson, Jackie Ickx, Emerson Fittipaldi.
That's double world champion, existing double world champion. Yeah.
And he beat all of them in that Race of Champions race. He also took pole at the British Grand Prix in 1975.
Yeah.
And I counted 6 former or future F1 champions on the grid.
Yeah.
And he beat them all. He did 42 Grand Prix, 2 podiums. But he was expected to do much more.
Austria 75.
Yeah.
And Brazil 76. Both but the problem was he was in the shadow. He wasn't in, in 75, 76. If you weren't in a McLaren or a Ferrari, you were never going to come anywhere. So you almost have to discount the fact that, because who was driving for McLaren and Ferrari then? So it was James Hunt, Jochen Mass, Niki Lauda, and Clay Regazzoni. And if your surname wasn't one of those, unless strange things happen, almost always you were going to be fighting for the bit. And also, those sorts of cars which were made by the sort of the British garagistas, without anything like the budgets that a McLaren or Ferrari can, they failed to finish so many times. And go and look, if you're listening to this and you're interested in the story of Tom Pryce, just go and look at him driving Formula One cars. And just look at the angles he tends to be driving.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He was unbelievable in the wet. I wrote this down, actually. In the race that he died in practice, he was the quickest driver in practice for that race. Quicker than Hunt, quicker than Lauda.
Wow.
Skidding these things about. He had such extraordinary natural car control. And you just think to yourself, if somebody had actually given him a car that was truly worthy of his talent. The Shadow wasn't a bad car, but it wasn't a McLaren and it wasn't a Ferrari. You just think, I think it's always very difficult to say, oh yes, he'd have been world champion, because you never know. But it's really hard to see, given what he did achieve in that car, how he wouldn't have at least won multiple races in a car that was
given the opportunity.
Yeah.
And the tragic thing about Tom Pryce is that his death was entirely unnecessary.
Totally needless. Yeah. Are we going to go there?
I think briefly mention how it happened.
Well, so
this is the South African Grand Prix 77.
He had a terrible start. He was last, was carving through the field. He went from 22nd to 13th in about, I don't know, not many laps. Overtook his teammate René Zorzi, was he?
No
I think
idea.
so. Anyway. Then his teammate has a problem with his car. That's right. There was a fuel metering issue with it or something like that, wasn't it? And I think basically the fuel was being sort of sprayed over its end. The back of the car sort of catches fire. So we think, oh, better park this. And so the back of this car's on fire. And there was a rule at Kyalami, which was the circuit they were at, which actually, given how ridiculously fast it was, wasn't actually that dangerous a circuit. But there was a rule that if anything catches fire, 2 fire attendants need to attend. And they're on the wrong side of the track. And coming down the straight is Hans Stuck, and behind him is Tom Pryce. And these two run across the track as fast as they can, one behind the other. Hans Stuck sees them and just instinctively just jinks out of the way. But Tom Pryce, who's right underneath his rear wing, just doesn't have time to do it. And hits the second one, who's a 19-year-old lad, who was carrying a heavy fire extinguisher. And that was the end of Tom Pryce and the track marshal. Yeah.
Oof. I mean, that just demonstrates how the protocols, how the procedures in the day were just hopeless. Hopeless.
You go back to Roger Williamson's accident. The fire marshals didn't have any fire retardant clothing.
It's such a simple thing.
You can't even imagine. So they couldn't put a fire out because they couldn't get close enough to the fire to put it out, even if they had all the right gear. And it's those sort of utterly needless accidents, to these fantastic, talents that just. I don't know. It's just terribly, terribly sad, isn't it?
It really is. I think you said there was one other driver that you wanted to mention.
Yeah, very different era. And again, a name that, if you consider what he did and who he was up against at the time, the fact that everybody hasn't heard of Stuart Lewis-Evans, I don't think most people have heard of Stuart Lewis-Evans. I just think is extraordinary. He was a really nice guy. not perhaps that cut out for. I mean, Formula One wasn't as cutthroat a business then as it is now, but he was just he was a good guy, and he won. So the first Formula One race he won was the Glover Trophy at Goodwood in 1957. So obviously non-championship, but driving a Connaught, and that sort of drew him to the attention of Tony Vandervelde, who had started the Van Wall Formula One team. And yeah, teammates were Sterling Moss and Tony Brooks.
Mm.
So, two of the greatest British drivers, not just of their era, but any era. And, he was completely competitive with them. What did he do? 1956, he came second in the Moroccan Grand Prix. He came fourth at Monaco in an old Connaught, and then the following year he got podiums at Spa and in Portugal. He was on pole in Zandvoort. He got pole at Zandvoort.
Yeah, wow.
So
you're quick.
Given that Sterling Moss has the same car, yeah, you're quick. And I think he was. Well, I would have spoken to Sterling about it. I know that Sterling respected him. And thought that he was a major talent. And then in the last race of 1958, he had an accident in his van wall. It caught fire. He got out of the car, but he was on fire by this stage. And again, he couldn't see the man with the fire extinguisher, ran in the wrong direction. And although they did get to him and they did put him out, he died in East Grinstead days later.
So they got him home.
They got him. So Vandervelde, chartered a plane, and he never complained. He was talking away. He must have been suffering terribly. And that was that. And after that, Tony Vandervelde lost all interest and love for the sport. Couldn't face it in exactly the same way that Brian Lister lost all his love for the sport after Archie Scott Brown got killed.
Oh, bloody hell. All right, we need to wrap this episode up, but the point of it really was to shine a light on these extraordinarily courageous and in many cases very, very talented people who left it all on the line in the name of motor racing. And I'm not going to talk about them, but I just want to name check a few more, because there are so many of them. There is Bob Anderson, who got killed in testing at Silverstone. There's John Taylor, who got killed at the Nürburgring. There was Mike Taylor. Mike Taylor wasn't killed, but in that ridiculous, appalling race at Spa in 1960, he had an accident which ended his career when the steering of his Lotus 18 broke. He sued Lotus. But again, just an insight into what people were dealing with at those days. His accident, he flew off the circuit and went so far out into the boonies, it took, I've heard 40 minutes. I can't believe 40 minutes. But it took a ridiculously long time. A, for anybody to even realise that something had happened. B, for them to twig that he hadn't just broken down on the side of the road. C, for them to go out and start looking for him. And then D, to finally get to where he was in the car. Find him and, hike him off to hospital. So Chris Irwin, another. Chris Irwin, I think, is still alive. He was another great talent, had a terrible accident at the Nürburgring in a thing called the Ford F3L, which was the successor to the GT40, so not Formula One. Unbelievably quick car, also unbelievably unstable car. He had a terrible accident at the Nürburgring, and that was, so there are so many of these, and these are just the British ones. I mean, there are scores of them. And actually, what I've realised recording this episode is that in so many cases, it's not just that the cars were dangerous, it's that the circuits were dangerous, their equipment, their helmets, their overalls, the protocols and procedures at the racetracks, all of it was just inadequate.
Well, I mean, even once you'd survived your accident, even once they got you, even once they got you out the car, I know Jackie Stewart had a big crash at Spa in 1965, I think, maybe 66. And I think that's what really got him going on the safety thing. Because I think, didn't they stick him in the back of the ambulance and then take off, and they hadn't shut the back doors, and he came out the back of the ambulance?
Oh my God.
And if you think of the medical facilities they have at circuits at the moment, and the helicopters and the overalls and the technology and the barriers and the structure of the cars and everything, I mean, it's a different sport, and thank goodness for that.
Yeah, thank goodness. It's so different now. Okay, well, we'll wrap this one up.
Yeah.
Blimey, some thought-provoking stuff in there, I think. Thank you ever so much for listening or for watching. I will just remind you all to subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to this channel. If you're listening on a podcast app, hit the little follow button or the plus button to follow the show. It really helps us. It means you don't miss an episode. And we'll be back again next week.